welcome to this very special Indianomics. Reserve Bank's flexible inflation targeting rule requires that every 5 years, the government shall, in consultation with the Reserve Bank, set the inflation target for the Monetary Policy Committee. The target of 4% CPI plus or minus 2% was set back in 2016 for 5 years till 2021. In March 2021, the government reviewed and retained the same target, the same range from 2021 to 26. Now, ahead of the review in 2026, the second review, the Reserve Bank has released a discussion paper asking members of the public to discuss and give feedback on the following 4 questions. 1, whether the MPC should target headline or core inflation, that is inflation minus food and fuel. 2, whether the 4% CPI target continues to remain the right target or whether it should be changed. 3, should the range of plus or minus 2% be narrowed, widened or done away with? 4, should the inflation target be removed and only the range be retained? Those are the 4 questions, and joining me to review the performance of India's inflation targeting regime and to answer these 4 questions are Sajjid Chinoy, Head of Asia Economic Research at JPMorgan, also one of the original members of the Urjit Patel Committee which recommended flexible inflation targeting. So, more questions to him. And Niranjan Rajadhyaksha, the Executive Director of Artha Global, a think tank and research organization, and formerly Executive Editor of Mint newspaper. He's everyone's best consultant for economics. Niranjan, Sajjid, thank you very much for joining me. Well, first up, let's assess. Is it a success? Last 10 years, after all, we did have 4-5 years during COVID. I think 4-5 quarters in COVID when we were above even 6%.
Right. So, Latha, we have 3 criteria, I think, that I use to judge how this is done. The first is, there are always going to be exogenous shocks. So, looking at absolute levels of inflation can be misleading. Look at how India has performed compared to the rest of the world. And that inflation differential with the rest of the world has narrowed meaningfully over the last decade. So, A, we have relatively outperformed, number 1. For me, perhaps the biggest test here is the whole idea of a nominal anchor, an inflation target, is to serve as a coordinating mechanism for the economy to anchor inflation expectations around the target. An easy way to test that is to say, does headline inflation converge to core or does core converge to headline? And what you see is before inflation targeting came into practice in India, the data reveals us clearly, core used to converge to headline. That's a fancy way of saying inflation expectations were not anchored. For the last decade, what do we see? After the FIT regime, headline inflation consistently converges to core once shocks dissipate. So that's another way of showing that the purpose of this, to anchor inflation expectations, has been achieved. You have less spillover of shocks to food and fuel spilling over into core inflation. And the last is just look at RBI's inflation expectations data. There are shocks that we've all been through this poly-crisis period, but expectations are more anchored. So by each of the 3 criteria, how we've done compared to the rest of the world, whether headline converges to core, and that's changed after inflation target came in, and how measured inflation expectations are, I think by all accounts, it's worked very well.
Okay, well, just for the data that RBI put in the discussion paper, average CPI since the 2016 adoption up till 21, up till the COVID actually, was 4.9%. Right. And average CPI from 2013 to 16, that is the new CPI series, was 6.8. So, their data is that statistically, at least, it has worked. But the CEA had opposed it, saying that in the first 5 years, anyway, food inflation everywhere was benign. In the next 3-4 years, food inflation was high and we didn't control. So that there is a counter argument. But Niranjan, you want to add success or failure?
No, I usually end up agreeing with most of what Sajjid says. So I completely agree with him, that...
the deviation from global...
I think that India is no longer an outlier. Say 10 years ago, if you looked at the world, it was battling deflation. Our inflation was pushing near double digits. Then, if you forget, you may say that the advanced economies are a different dynamic. But if you look at China, if you look at even peer economies of Asia, India was like 3, 4, 5 percentage points higher than the average. So I agree with Sajjid. And I think the more important point is what he just mentioned about the dynamics between core and inflation and headline inflation. That if headline inflation is eventually converging to core whenever there is a temporary differential, it means that in a way people trust, he said inflation expectations, I would say people trust the Reserve Bank of India to keep inflation on target or close to target. So, yeah, I agree with Sajjid that it's done quite well. There are, there'll always be debates about how the mandate is interpreted, etc. But net, I think it's worked for us.
Yeah. No, I think the missing chair here is the CEA. If I can convince him, I should get him. But he has very good arguments why the the framework itself is not appropriate even for developed countries. But that is not the mandate given by RBI. RBI has accepted flexible inflation. They are only asking the members of the public to argue within that.
Yeah.
The target is not being questioned at all. I mean, the framework is not being questioned.
Yeah, and Latha, I think the issue is how do you interpret the target? So if you look at not the monetary, the Reserve Bank, the amended Reserve Bank Act, but even the monetary policy agreement, it's not that growth is completely out of the equation, So there is a trade-off which the RBI has to, but in normal times, inflation management should be the, the standard, the main focus. And secondly, RBI is a full-service central bank, so it has to, in some way intervene in the foreign exchange market. It has financial stability, financial development, tools. I think the key thing is you should ask yourself that the RBI or the MPC has control over the repo rate. How are interest rates going to be matched to the inflation rate? It doesn't mean that RBI should do nothing but inflation control.
Okay. No, that's a fair question. We'll just come to that in a bit. But let me take the first question that the Reserve Bank has put on our plate. Core or headline? Now, I think there is a very legit argument that food is not controllable by the Reserve Bank. And, I counted from August of 2023 to December of 2024, 18 months, inflation was well above 6. In fact, it was between 8 and 11%. Yeah. But it did impact core. And RBI could do precious little about it. The argument is that by looking at it, you kept the system tight. Is that therefore...
So it is true that the food,
should be
food inflation and fuel inflation
core.
Is, they're more susceptible to exogenous shocks, whether it's climate shocks, international geopolitics, etc. So accepted. But eventually, if your about 50% of your basket is fuel and food, you really can't have an inflation targeting framework and say that I'm only going to target half the CPI. The second is revealed preference. When the Ujit Patel committee was discussing this, and I remember, Sajjid and I had a chat about it way back then. I don't know if he remembers. Thailand was one of the only economies in Asia which actually was targeting core. Thailand...
Uganda is also.
Yes. So now in this RBI paper, I think only Uganda is the... So I think there is, there is some logic, even other central banks, if you see the record, they are looking at headline inflation as their main target.
Yes, 48 countries.
Because Latha, it comes down to ultimately how does the framework work? And a key part, as I said, is to serve as a coordinating mechanism. See, inflation is both a function of slack, but also expectations. Therefore, it becomes so self-fulfilling. And so if this is meant to be a coordinating mechanism, you can't have an inflation target for a central bank that is very divorced from the lived experience of individuals. If 40-45% of your consumption is going to be food, and hopefully that will come down over time, but if it's going to be 40% of food, and that's what impacts your inflation expectations, then you can't have a central bank that's looking at another measure independent of that. The other quick point to make is if you get sustained shocks to food, they may, in a tight labor market, translate into wages, right? So by ignoring the food part and only focusing on cost, sometimes it's too late. The genie has left the bottle by the time headline, the food shock goes into core.
Yeah, I still have sympathy for the idea that central banks can't control food. And also in those 18 months that I just spoke about, we did not see it come over, this feeling that, food is expensive and therefore I need higher wages, was not the trend observed. So the charge that by looking at food, the Reserve Bank probably tends to keep the economy tight remains, and the counterfactual can never be proved. Would the economy have grown more if they had not kept it tight? We don't know.
That's when the F, the flexible inflation targeting matters. Why do you have a 200 basis point band around it? When we debated that 12 years ago, it was precisely because of this.
Okay.
That there are occasions in which there is a shock to food, which is 40%, and if core is much lower than that, the central bank has the latitude to keep inflation about. We saw that in the pandemic. In the pandemic, inflation was consistently above 4%, but the RBI did not respond to that given the contextual circumstances.
Fair point.
This
But I still
goes
want
back
to
to the point I was trying to make, that a lot also then depends on how the RBI interprets its mandate, because there are sometimes very, very good reasons to look through temporary shocks to food, or, we've seen like vegetables often, spark off a bout of high inflation. So a lot depends on how the RBI interprets its mandate. I think there is enough, if there are no observable second-order effects, either in terms of firm markups or in terms of higher wage demands, which will then flow into a second round of price hikes. I think the central bank is within its mandate to look through a temporary period of high inflation.
Yes, and I think they've communicated it beautifully at the times when they looked through.
And we've been through 3 years of this in the pandemic. That's my point.
Just one more before I finish this, and I want to go to the point of whether it should be 4 or 5 or 3, whether it should change. That's the more important argument for me. Should they, should we tweak the sentence in some way to give importance to core? I mean, the target is still headline inflation at 5 or at 4 or whatever. But core gets an emphasis. Should we accept that governments can't control food? Is there a need to tweak?
See, there are different measures of inflation, right? So we have a WPI index, you have a CPI index, you have core inflation, you have a GDP deflator. Now, as and when, somebody says that you should look at GDP deflator, sometimes you say an average of WPI per CPI. The question is, how do economic agents, what do they respond to? What does the man on the street respond to? That person, he or she is not responding to your
WPI.
core inflation or your WPI or GDP deflator. This is for us to, discuss in television studios. But I think the average person, what hits the family budget is the entire headline, the entire CPI. And that can change behavior if it leads to unanchored inflation expectations.
10 seconds, Latha. If you burden the RBI, I think the first thing we agreed on, Niranjan, 10 years ago when we met, or 15 years ago, was the Tinbergen principle. Yeah. You must have as many instruments as you have objectives. If you were to have focus on headline, focus on core, focus on growth, you're diluting the whole idea of inflation target. If you give the RBI...
change the sentence at all.
It's going to get so muddled that nobody is going to know what the RBI is eventually after. Yeah. And I go back to the beginning. What is the purpose of this? This purpose is to anchor expectations. If you have so many objectives, no one knows what you're after, how can you anchor expectations around anything?
Yeah, actually, Mishkin, the economist, is quoted, and he's saying that central banks may emphasize headline as target, but be guided more by core while deciding.
That's in advanced economies where core is typically 70 to 80% of your basket.
And see, even the US Fed, they sometimes look at PF, private final consumption expenditure deflator. These are inputs into the decision-making process. The target is
So don't explicitly change it, but it will...
So again, it depends on how you interpret your mandate.
Monetary policy is an art, not a science. And I think the framework is meant to provide this combination of stability.
We have to take the next question quickly. 5% or 4%. Should we stick with 4?
Yeah. So the way I look at it is this way. The 4% came out of very sophisticated statistical, including by the Urjit Patel committee, but even other economists, that this is the sort of inflation level which maximizes output on a sustained basis. Now, the way I look at it also is that 10 years ago, the advanced economies, they were targeting 2% inflation. Normally, because of what is called the Balassa-Samuelson effect, another 2% is added to an emerging market. So in a way, the anchor of that, is the 2% which the...
Developed economy.
And then you add 2%. So now, if you are saying that inflation has moved up over the past, especially now...
Globally, yeah.
Is there a case to push it up to 5%? Maybe. But the reason I would still argue against it is that it opens a Pandora's box. Because once you start fidgeting with the inflation target, you can create confusion. So I personally feel that there could be a technical argument for a 5% inflation rate, but then you basically said every 5 years you will have something else, some different target. And when the idea is that over a medium term you want to stabilize expectations. So I think that keeping this anchor makes sense.
Okay, Niranjan, that's crucial. You believe that there is a reason to push it to 5, but you want the target to remain at 4. I want Sajjid's views on that, but after a very quick break. Stay right there. Welcome back to Indianomics. The Reserve Bank has put a discussion paper on whether the inflation targeting framework of 4% plus or minus 2% should continue for the next 5 years. We have time till September 18th to give advice to the Reserve Bank. And that's why today I have with me economists Sajjid Chinoy and Niranjan Rajadhyaksha to comment on the 4 questions that the Reserve Bank is asking members of the public. Before going to break, Niranjan argued strongly that, yes, there may be a case to push up the target inflation to 5, but he would prefer to keep it at 4. So that question to you, Sajjid.
That's the only area where we modestly differ. So I take the other way. I think what we did back in 2013, and it holds still now, is look at the threshold rate of inflation. And what you find is that once inflation goes above 6%, right, on a consistent basis, then you get heightened levels of uncertainty. It affects investment, affects growth prospects. So if you take it anywhere above 4 and you're going to have a band over there, you're too close to the 6%, number one. Number two, there is this concept of the natural rate of inflation. Hard to, because it's unobservable. It's like the natural rate of interest. Hard to model empirically. But there's a lot of evidence needed to suggest it is close to 4%. Now, this does not depend on monetary policy. It depends on demographics, it depends on risk aversion, it depends on investment savings rates. So if you're finding that India's natural rate of inflation is 4%, which then goes back to the point you made between 2016 and 19, we were close to 4. And nobody can argue that the hit to growth was large. So both of these would argue that if your natural rate is 4% and 6% becomes the threshold above which bad things happen in the economy, and you need a band around it, then I think 4% seems the obvious target to continue with.
Okay. I have some sympathy for Niranjan's argument that globally inflation seems to be pushing up. And Charles Goodhart was the one who said that for the decade he sees it. Of course, he said that before the pandemic. There is some upward pressure on inflation. So, there may be some sympathy for raising it. But the point is, can that be done by altering the band? That is the third question that they are putting on our plate. Is it plus or minus 2%? Is that too wide? Should we now be mature enough to make it 1?
So the band is a function of how exposed your inflation is to sudden shocks to fuel and food, right? And because, as we said, 45% or so of the CPI is so, maybe 10, 15 years later, as India keeps growing at the current rate, and the food and fuel basket is a much smaller part of the inflation index, then maybe a sudden, a bad monsoon and, just like a spike in vegetable prices will not have that big an impact. So I would say narrowing the band makes sense only when you're sure that these exogenous shocks are not as big a problem in the total index.
Total index. Fair point. What would your view be?
So I would say, as exactly what Niranjan said, as we become more mature and as the weight of
India
food...
is supposed to narrow.
Yeah, where food goes down. So in subsequent consumer expenditure surveys, you should see that food should go from 46 to 40. When that becomes down, we should reduce that band to 1%, right? And in the limit, a decade from now, we don't want a band. And that goes back to, the weight of core being, again, 70, 80%, so that headline and core eventually converge like in the US, right? And the weight of food coming down, and expectations become so anchored around that, that, you don't worry about second-order effects. I'll just say one quick thing about global inflation going up. Till 2019, we were worried about US deflation, and the fact that central banks were struggling to hit their inflation target from the bottom. So these fashions change every 5 to 7 years. What I will say is, for greenflation and the like may affect relative price levels, and we should not conflate relative price shocks with aggregate price shocks.
Okay, well, that was also the CEA's argument when he said, for 10 years, the governments in central banks in developed countries could not push up inflation to 2%. So why are central banks arrogating to themselves that power at all? the last word, no, you don't want to change from target to the range. That's the fourth question.
No, not at all.
You want you want the 4%.
I think because, 2 to 6 is like, it's all around, means suppose the Reserve Bank then says, fine, I'm comfortable with 5.5% because it's within that range.
Right.
And then you have some temporary shock and it takes to 8% and then you're in trouble, So, no, I think the central point of that range should be the inflation.
The moral pressure of 4% should remain. Sajjid, Thailand, Indonesia, many of those countries started with 7, 8 or 5% and have moved down to 2.5%. Now we are in the third, 5-year period. We are neither changing the bracket, nor are we bringing it down. I mean, just continuing as it was 10 years ago, no need to change.
Each country is going to take time to get there. You would expect over time, given demography, investment savings behavior and risk preferences, that the natural rate of inflation comes down to below 4%. But till you can establish that, it's premature to push inflation down. So I would think that you stay at 4% and stabilize everyone's expectations around it, keep narrowing the band. So eventually we go from 3 to 5. Right? And then you progressively come down as the data suggests that. Remember also, of the 12 years that this has been in existence de facto, in the last 5 years, we've seen unprecedented shocks. This is a poly-crisis world.
Yes.
So that's interrupted the process of stabilizing expectations. And so we need to give that more time.
Yeah, so we'll get there, hopefully. Niranjan, very quickly, running out of time, but you had in your Mint article some good advice for government, central bank and the MOSPI.
Yeah, so again, just going back to the issue of, picking up second-round effects. Now, suppose there's a shock to inflation, whether it's core, whether it's headline, but let's say headline inflation. Now, what happens? There are two channels this can lead to an inflationary spiral. One is that labor markets are tight and people start demanding more wages, which feeds into inflation, or companies have pricing power and they push up the price they charge consumers. Now, the question is then we have to ask ourselves, and you also mentioned this, that, wages were stable, that is a temporary inflation shock feeding into either the labor market or the product markets? For that, you need data, you see. And my point is that, I think MOSPI is a very, very credible set of data we usually get. And now, MOSPI has been trying to improve its services. But I think end of the day, we still don't have a national wage series. What we have, and see, wages are unique in economics.
Have some rural wage data.
Yeah, but rural wage data it's not the same as something collected by MOSPI on a national scale. Sometimes people use, wages bill of listed companies, etc. So I think a wage, because wages are unique in economics in the sense that they add to cost, but they also add to demand, So it's a two-way thing. The second actually is about the companies, that are companies increasing prices? And for that, what you need is a PPI, a producer price index. It's the tricky one, and so everybody has said we need a PPI. The tricky one is a PPI for services. If that were to be available, then the RBI can actually spot whether inflation is, spreading through the economy, or is it just something which you can look through.
Okay. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Unfortunately, out of time, not out of questions. One rapid fire. Will Reserve Bank cut on October 1st?
I think they should, given the uncertainty, wait and assess. They've got meetings in the future to decide as well.
Rajat?
I don't have a view, frankly, so I'll not.
Pass? Yeah. Okay, but that debate for another day. Thank you very much, Sajjid and Niranjan, for enriching our understanding of how the MPC at the Reserve Bank should look at inflation targeting. Let's wait to see what the Reserve Bank advises and what the government does. We will know only in March 2026. Wrap up on Indianomics. Thanks for watching.